Well, good evening. Welcome to Motorcycle Mentor. This is episode 3, and now I'm going to get more specific. I'm going to deal with different systems at a time, and today I'm going to deal with brakes, and I'm going to show you some practical examples. Typically, modern motorcycles use disc brakes, and I shall show you what that means. The older motorcycles used to use a drum, and I shall show you an example of that. But the disc brakes is what we'll concentrate on. Right. So this is a disc caliper. This is a disc rotor, and that's a caliper on the rotor. The lighting's going to get very weird in here because the sun's shining in. And that's got, you can see the pads there. This is what the pads look like. It's a metal backplate that fits up against the piston, and that's the friction material. So basically what happens is the caliper pinches the pads against the rotor like that and creates friction and slows it down. Two types of calipers. This is the more old-fashioned type. This is a twin piston caliper. So the fluid comes in there, it fills up the whole body of the caliper assembly under immense pressure. It pushes those two pistons in, they pinch the rotor, and they slow the bike down. Now this is a more modern example. This is a single piston floating caliper, whereas the other one was a fixed caliper. So this only uses one piston, but what happens in this case is the one piston puts pressure on the rotor, and in doing so it moves the whole assembly against these sliders on the mounting and forces the other pad to come into contact with the disc on that side. Basically the same thing. It's just that rather than using a piston each side, it uses just one piston and then pulls the whole assembly over to brake the bike. The more modern motorcycles, for example, this Suzuki here uses two pistons, but it's a floating caliper assembly. It's basically the same thing. It's just that what they've done is they've put two of these on one side, and we've got the same system exactly. I'll show you a caliper. This is actually a caliper that's very, very seized. I'm going to put the camera down for a second. Right. And you can see here how the calipers, they're held in by pins, and that's the pad material. This one, what can happen on these motorbikes, and this is the reason I mention it, is that these pins can seize on old bikes. So what happens is this whole assembly won't move over. So what happens is this pad, it pushes on the rotor, it gets worn down, it slightly distorts the rotor in the process, and this pad doesn't get much use. And you can see here how that one pad has hardly got any wear in it at all. Sorry, it's been almost worn out, and that one's hardly got any wear in it at all, because the mounting that this is seized. And I can show you how it actually floats. This is an example here. You can see how the whole assembly is kind of floats backwards and forwards, and this is the mounting. So that's the calipers. Next we come to the master cylinder. The caliper is the slave cylinder. That's the assembly for that. And then the master cylinder is something like this. This is how it works. Okay, this is an unactivated one. So you've got the reservoir is full of fluid. This is the reservoir here. It's full of fluid. When you pull the lever, it pushes against this piston, which has got two seals in it, and it pushes over that. That's the filler orifice between the reservoir and the actual master cylinder itself. It seals it over so that it won't push fluid back up into there, and basically pressurizes the whole system, pushes fluid down the line, so it goes down a long brake line and then into the caliper, and that's basically how it works. So what I've got here is the unactivated version, and this is the activated version. You can see how the piston's moved across, it's sealed that hole, and it's just putting pressure on there. There's a lever effect, basically. It's a fulcrum lever effect. So you can imagine you have a lever, you want to move a really heavy rock with a big long piece of plank. So at this end you have a long extension, a lot of movement, not much pressure, not much movement here, but enormous pressure. And so basically that's the same thing with the hydraulic braking system. So this master cylinder is a very small diameter, typically about that big, and then the slave cylinder is much bigger, typically about this big. So what happens is there's that, as this one moves, it'll move, I don't know, let's say it moves half an inch. What's that in millimetres? I don't know, 6-7 millimetres. No, it's more than that, isn't it? It's 10 millimetres. What'll happen, I don't know metric system. What'll happen is this piston here will move probably not even a millimetre. You know, it's microscopic, but the pressure is astonishing. It's huge. So it really pinches this. I mean, you can lock up a front wheel of a motorbike or a car. So hydraulic brakes are the most common system. This, as I say, is a typical. This is an older master cylinder brake lever assembly off a Honda an old CB500. This is a rear master cylinder assembly. It's just got the rod up underneath there, so it's pretty much the same thing. It's just, it looks slightly different because it pushes from underneath rather than from the side. With any of these applications, you can probably see on this little cap here, it says use .3. I'm going to try and focus on that if I can. Does it say .3? I've got my glasses with me. Use only .3 brake fluid. This is on the top there. I don't know if you can see that. This is .3. Now, I'm not sure of the exact chemical constituents of brake fluid, but what I do know is that .3 has a lower boiling point than .4. So a more modern motorcycle, for example this Suzuki here, will use .4, or that Triumph over there, it actually says .4 on the master cylinder, I think. Yes, use only .4. So, this is very important. You should never use .3 in a .4 system, because it's, as I say, they're not really compatible. In an emergency you could, if you're in a dire emergency in the middle of nowhere, you could add .3 top up a braking system, a .4 braking system, but normally you wouldn't. It is feasible to use .4 and a .3 braking system. It's best not to. It's always best to keep it consistent. But you can actually add .4 to .3. It's not the end of the world. But I prefer to keep things distinct, just because it's the way it's designed. This last thing here, this is a drum brake. This is completely different. So what this has, it has a lever, a long rod that attaches to there, and then what happens is it turns that cam, which spreads the shoes, and the shoes fit up against a drum. I'll give you an example. Here's a drum here. There's the same lever, so as that moves, it forces the shoes out against the inside of that drum. So that's how that stops. Not very often used these days on motorcycles, it's pretty much died out. This Yamaha V-Star, little 250 V-Star, still has a drum rear brake. It's more of a novelty these days. It's used a bit on scooters, I think, but it's a rarity. So that's pretty unusual. There's no hydraulics in that. I've only ever come across hydraulic drum brakes on a motorcycle twice. It's very rare. It's nearly always mechanical, so that you can forget about if you have that. But anything that has a disc rotor is going to be hydraulic. Now, as far as checking the fluid is concerned, most motorcycles have a sight glass. I'm going to show you here. Now, you can just see there's a sight glass, and you can just see that, you might be able to see it, just the little line of fluid there. So that's up to level. This is .4, so you don't need to do anything about that. If you had to top it up, then what you would do is you would use a really good screwdriver. I've got a T-handled Phillips crosshead here. It fits into the screw slot perfectly, because what you don't want to do is strip those screws, and on older bikes it's very easily done. So you basically just undo those, and the same goes for the back. It's exactly the same. The back, quite often they have 3 screws or 3 nuts. It's kind of difficult to do this with one hand, but I'm going to persevere. And underneath here there'll be a rubber diaphragm, or a neoprene diaphragm, which is concertinaed. So the idea is that it'll contain the brake fluid. I'm going to put that on the seat, which I probably shouldn't do, but there you Needs must when the devil drives, as they say. This is just a little, that keeps the shape. So this here is a concertina shape. You can see here that, and the idea of this is as the fluid drops, because obviously as the brake pads wear, more fluid fills up the chamber to compensate for that, so the fluid level here drops. So this allows for that, but it also prevents fluid from leaking out through the top of the cap. So there's the fluid in there. There's the concertina neoprene section of the I can't really see what I'm looking at here. So if you ever need to top it up, it usually needs very little. I would always check the brake pads first just to make sure that they're not worn out, because that's the usual reason why fluid levels drop. But if it's just dropped, you can add this, and this actually could probably use a little drop, but it's not the end of it. But it's hardly anything, you know. At 20 cc's are probably more than enough in there. So I'm going to put this back on. It's always important to keep everything very clean. I don't know how I'm doing this one-handed, but I am doing it one-handed somehow. And as I say, the most important thing in the world, especially on an older motorcycle, is a really good, close, tight-fitting crosshead screwdriver, because there's nothing more aggravating than a stripped screw here. You have to drill them out, and that's the long and the short of it. So what I do, especially on a bike I haven't looked at before, is I'll get this screwdriver. I'll usually tap it with just give it a little tap with a hammer on the end, just here, and then I'll put a lot of downward pressure on it, and then I'll very carefully but firmly, you know, undo it, unscrew it, and that usually gets them undone. It's very rare if I have to drill them out. Sometimes you do, and it's just one of those things. But usually I can get away with it. So that's basically the braking system. That's all there is to it. I'm going to show you very quickly here. That's the line. So that goes from the master cylinder up here. So it's just a tube, basically. It's a high pressure tube that feeds the fluid. It's a completely closed system, so there's nothing else in there. If you do have air in the fluid, which sometimes happens, you can undo that bleed nipple, just a fraction, put a hose on it into a bucket of fluid, and then just, you know, activate the brake and just squeeze the air bubbles out, and then top up the fluid. But that's probably going to be for another time. But basically that's how the brakes work. Hydraulic pressure from the master cylinder down to there, squeezes the pads up against the disc, and stops the bike. Okay, thank you for watching. Episode 4 next week.